hopefully it'll, because I was showing this to Dave Weigel and my computer basically broke, and I also just spilled some coffee in front of me. I'm all over the place. So cute, my little Hasanito. So last time you and I had a conversation on this broadcast, we talked about Kamala Harris's chances, or what it would look like. I think it was before Kamala Harris became the candidate, or was it right after?
It was right after, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. And some of the things that I was like very worried about on the messaging front was that, I was fearful that the Democrats might pull the old tricks that the Democrats always engage with, which is to like moderate their views and try to like hammer on this like moderate Republican framing on a lot of issues, adopt Republican framing on a lot of issues, which I thought would potentially be a dangerous gamble in the electoral calculus for the likes of Kamala Harris. And I was wondering, since you've been, all right, bye guys. Sorry, I just have my buddy who's picking up his monitor. But the question I have for you is, since that conversation, do you feel like the Democrats have? I do genuinely think the Democrats have changed their messaging or rather, moved to the middle as best as possible, sometimes directly to the right. And do you feel like that has been successful?
Well, I think it's definitely the strategy. I think you correctly identified what ended up being true. Like at the time in which we were talking, there was that kind of burst of energy. There was the party reuniting around her. And I think there was an open opportunity of interest for people to say, okay, let me take another look at this person who I may not know a lot about. As they've started to add meat to the bones on that front, they've almost exclusively done that from a Republican or more centrist lens, whether that is basically conceding Donald Trump's crisis or its ascribed crisis on immigration, whether that is a policy front where she's talked about a bipartisan council of advisors or the need to have a Republican in the cabinet, whether that's campaigning with Liz and Dick Cheney. It's basically been the only place she's been willing to show any type of break from Biden on is saying, I'm Biden, except more open to kind of Republican and centrist ideas. We had Mark Cuban on our podcast, and one of the things he's saying, he was like, I did not like Biden because I felt that he was anti-business and anti-billionaire in some senses. And he has felt, this is just me saying what he said.
Yeah.
And he said that one of the biggest differences he's seen is that Harris calls him up and that Harris has tried to have an openness on that front. And so when I asked Cuban, I was like, well, isn't she trying to be everything to everyone? I talked to Bernie Sanders, who said that she could be open to progressives. He's like, I think progressives are kidding themselves. And this is a centrist president who's making that clear. And I kind of think he's right. Like, I kind of think that Harris has now positioned herself not just as someone who is more, quote unquote, moderate, but is preparing for, I think, maybe a Republican Senate or a divided Washington. And I do think the Democrats have basically tried to course correct from 2019, where they think they were too progressive. And they've done this in the last month or so. And so it's come off, I think, as if she is rejecting the last primary and the position she used to have. But I really think it's a kind of party apparatus that's trying to recalibrate itself and is frankly conceding that that has to come from the center, at least in their view. Now, if that's successful, I don't know if I agree with that analysis, but I agree that's their thinking.
Yeah. So there's two different questions I have, I guess. I'm of two different minds here. On the one hand, I like to say I put my, Harris Waltz analyst hat on, right? And think about it as like, is this an effective way to run a campaign for the general election? Like, will this be a winning strategy? And then I also have this pesky little, like, my own personal opinion on the matter. And then I think even if it is successful in terms of winning the election, what does that say about the future of not only the Democratic Party, but just like the future of American governance in general? And I don't think that it is as profoundly and as overtly successful in the way that like the Democratic analysts think. And I wanted to show you this blueprint 2024 public opinion research that came out on messaging
Hmm.
and the preference effects it has. And I wanted to hear your perspective on that. Hold on, I'm going to share my screen with you real quick. Let's see
Yep.
if that works. Last time I did this, my computer basically broke, but hopefully it'll, because I was showing this to Dave Weigel and my computer basically broke. And I also just spilled some coffee in front of me. I'm all over the place. So, have you seen this already?
I don't think so.
So yeah, it shows the hypothetical answers. What, if anything, would have done differently than President Biden over the past 4 years? And it shows the preference effect overall and the preference effect from independents.
Yeah.
And some of her most progressive policies that I've definitely been on board with, that I definitely appreciate, such as at home. Hold on, let me do this real quick. Okay, such as at home medical care, at home Medicare, the expansion of Medicare to also cover home assistance, to cover at home health care. Plus 10 for Harris. Preference effect for independents, also plus 10 for Harris. Framing it as like greedy corporations. I'm not happy with what greedy corporate giants got away with over the past last few years, since the pandemic. Price gouging, which has been an incredibly resilient policy point from the Harris camp, regardless of the attacks, including but not limited to even the New York Times, like doing the classic, like, we brought forward our economists and they thought this is not even possible to do. This is, regardless of that, it seems like the American public is very receptive to this idea, although it is a profoundly, dare I say, radical policy, if we're being real. I mean, I think it's very effectively messaged, because you're not saying we're going to institute price caps, but it's been very popular. Whereas in terms of the actual answers, like the further down you go, the more she talks about like small businesses or the opportunity economy, or what is my only difference from Joe Biden? Oh, I'll have a Republican in my cabinet. The preference effect is underwater. Minus 21 when she says not an actual thing.
I mean, I think that tracks with some of my reporting and experience. And I mostly think that because the desire for change and the dissatisfaction with the status quo has always been more evident in the electorate than I've seen the Democratic Party acknowledge in this cycle. For the first 2 years, they were holding on to Biden. And I don't think that was just a problem because of his age. I think that was also a problem because it kind of tied them in to a status quo that, for a lot of people, they're not really working from the premise of that being what they want. And so, so I think that they were just late to arriving, that even in just switching candidates, there was another barrier that she had to clear, is what is the difference between you and the previous candidate? And they just arrived just to kind of articulating any of those differences. But let me explain to you what I think is, or what my kind of reporting tells me is the campaign's thinking on this front. Like, it's not just that centrist policies have often been where the Democratic Party reflexively goes in the general. It is their lessons from the last midterm election and the presidential election before that. They basically have gotten away from the idea that they can change the electorate by bringing in a whole bunch of new people and bringing in some progressives or young people or the like. And they've pretty much embraced the idea that they should win over those people who are most consistently going to vote. And as much as the electorate looks like that, that's better for Harris, because that's the kind of anti-Trump coalition. And so I think it's an effort for them not to really just target the folks they know are most likely going to show up to the polls, and try to get the gang back together that caused them to do better than expected in the midterms. It's a very like battleground specific strategy, but I also think it's a strategy that kind of concedes the issues to Trump
Yeah.
and concedes him as the main character of the race. And so, why we could have had a race that was kind of two competing visions or two directions of the country, I think it's directions. I think there's a competence difference. I'm not saying they're the same. I guess I'm saying they are not playing, they're not starting from a different premise. And
Yeah.
partially that's because they don't really think they need to win. They think the type of people who come out and they know are going to come out they're willing to take a Trump referendum because they think basically 55-45 chance anti-Trump beats Trump. I
Yeah.
just think that's a little risky. And so, like, the risk of that has been something I have just been shocked about their unwillingness to price in. But that's the thinking when you see the kind of messaging shifts that you're, I think, right in identifying over the last couple months.
Especially risky for Kamala Harris, because when I look at the polls that say, regardless of her like very clear communication, especially since the swap out, that she is going to be a conservative. She wants a muscular military, a lethal military, right? Like all
Yeah.
this stuff. How she owns a Glock, and she's not afraid to use it if you come to her
Yeah.
house, and that she's gonna follow the law on all this stuff. You're all right there, Astead?
Yeah, my phone keeps falling from my makeshift stand.
Yeah. No, it's all good. Regardless of all of that stuff, Americans still view Kamala Harris by 46% as too liberal. And I
Yeah.
think you and I both know what the real reason for that is, right? It's not her messaging, it's not her communication, and it's not because the broader electorate is like much more conservative, or I guess they are a little conservative in their broad reception of Kamala Harris, but it's not actually about policies. It's because she's a black woman. I think that is the real reason why they view her as liberal, too liberal,
I
quote unquote.
Yeah, I think that is 90% of the reason. I think that and even in my own experience, like, you'll go places and the assumptions that black folks are inherently this like progressive, even if he doesn't even fit with sometimes the facts of black electorate and communities. The only thing I would add to that though is I think it's also tied for me to how she introduced herself to the country in 2019.
Yeah.
She and I think this is still the kind of core problem with people's understanding of her ideology. She was half a progressive messenger back then. And so I think because the last primary, there was such an incentive for everybody who wasn't Joe Biden to basically flirt with this kind of progressive aesthetic.
Yeah.
I think it fueled the idea that she was a San Francisco liberal.
Yeah.
And if she would have come out in that race and been, I think, the moderate she mostly is, I think we could have had a different reality. But I think the assumptions based on identity plus what we saw in 2019 adds up to something where I think the campaign has a challenge of authenticity that they have to clear. Like, you have to tell policy is mostly a proxy for people. Most people understand, who I talk to at least, that when politicians promise something on the trail, it won't often happen because of the realities of governance and Congress and stuff.
Yeah.
You're mostly signaling to people who you are, what you believe in, and what the story you're telling of yourself and your beliefs are. And I just think her story has been inconsistent. And so I thought they would come into this race after the candidate switch and understand that and kind of more frontally own the pivot. Say, hey, 2019 was a little crazy. Maybe Democrats did that. Maybe Democratic Party was someplace I wasn't. I've been in the White House for 4 years and I've learned how governing works. Now I'm this person, whatever, sure. But they've kind of tried to do that without saying it most explicitly. And I think that's helping fuel some of the kind of thirst for more answers and tougher questions and things like that. Is because I don't think you can say a new way. I think when you say a new way forward and you were the vice president and also you haven't had a primary to explain any differences from you and the rest of your party,
Yeah.
I think it's fair for people to say, what does that mean? you
Yeah.
know and I think that's a question they haven't really answered. And the biggest thing I would say is, if you don't answer that, then you're kind of a status quo candidate. you know you're kind of representing now in a time when people want change. And so you can bring change through identity or representation or the like, but at some point I think the best version of a Democratic candidate is one that actually lays a vision forward. And I still think we're asking, what is the Kamala Harris vision?
Yeah, and with 17 days out from the election, I think it's like I think that is I mean, it's a difficult endeavor. It's definitely very difficult to have this truncated campaign and launch it with like a couple months out from the actual deadline. Having said that, I do think that the policy prescriptions that they had, some good and some I think falling significantly short of what is necessary, have caused this issue for people, especially when you're conceding to right wing framing on a lot of these issues. Now,
Yeah.
the reason why I brought up the fact that people perceive her as too liberal, San Francisco black woman, regardless of the fact that she's literally, called herself a top cop, right?
Hmm.
Um, and had some relatively progressive initiatives at the time, but also communicated a very even dare I say reactionary point of view on other in other
Hmm.
moments throughout her prosecutor tenure.
Hmm.
I think that given that, when I saw this battleground, I thought, especially paired up with the reality that like 70% of Americans want a different way forward, like they
Yep.
want to change from Joseph Robinette Biden. I thought that she would run a 2008 Obama style campaign that was like more progressive, or rather, like communicated, actively targeted the harm and communicated the desires of the broader populace. And I don't think that she did that. To like I don't think she did that, especially when it comes to like her economic policies. Like there's the good, you got the price gouging, right? We're
Hmm.
going to lower these costs. You're hurting. You're hurting when you go and you purchase groceries. I see that. I see you. I hear you. I'm going to fix that. Americans don't care if someone goes and says, that's Venezuela, that's communism. That much is
Yep.
clear to me. This policy, when she unfolded it, price gouging, was polling around 73%. After she unveiled it, and then Republicans launched attacks against it, calling it like, this is Venezuela, this is price
Yep.
caps, you don't want this, this is devastating, this is going to be horrible, Commie Harris, whatever, Comrade Harris, Comrade Kamala. It polled at 83%, like a
Yep.
month later. Americans don't care. They don't. And that's why I was a little bit more hopeful, although cautiously optimistic, I guess, when I saw Tim Walz, because I thought they are going to have to lock in and communicate to everyone that these policies that are called radical by everyone, whether it's the media or whether it's the Republicans, are actually very helpful. Like feeding children is not a radical prospect, right?
Hmm.
Paid family leave is not a radical prospect. Tim Walz actually did a really good job communicating that with both
Yeah.
Ezra Klein and on numerous occasions before he was actually selected as the vice president, where he would frame it as like, this is how you help small businesses, right?
Yeah.
Paid medical and family leave, allow small businesses to be more competitive with giants, like with massive chain retail stores, for example. Mom and pop shops can now be more competitive. Sure, you'll pay a little bit more in taxes, but at the end of the day, you don't have to pay for all of that. And now you can be competitive against like a Walmart, right? A big chain. Because
But
those guys can potentially do paid family leave if
yeah.
necessary, because they have a lot more leeway.
The only thing I'd say, and it's kind of a bleak response though, is you're working from the premise of public opinion being the most important thing, and that's not always true for them, right? So things can poll well, they could even be popular among a broader voting base. But things like price gouging were specifically targeted by a kind of elite centrist class, right? They don't, and I think those folks have an outsized amount of power because we know kind of how donors get direct lines to candidates and campaigns.
Yeah.
Even when we have talked to the kind of money side of the Democratic Party, it's oftentimes a focus on things like price gouging. They don't, or even the FTC coordinator Lena Khan has been a
Yeah.
focus for them, and some of the specific kind of progressive pieces of Biden. And so sometimes the reason a candidate backs off from those policies isn't even because it's not polling well or it's not popular, but it's unpopular with the wrong people, frankly. And the other thing I would kind of add to this is, Biden had such a long history of being the bipartisan moderate white guy that his general election challenge was the other side. And he was actually fine with that. He was doing a lot of overt plays for progressives, a
Yeah.
lot of overt messaging on policy. And I think even policy wise, he was willing to kind of embrace more progressive domestic ideas specifically because there was no fear that anyone's going to think Joe Biden is a radical, you
Yeah.
know? There's a different level of cautiousness coming from them because she doesn't have that sort of ideological root or story with the public. And so I think they could have taken different strategies on how to actually, deal with that electorally. But it's very clear that the one they've landed on is one that is a moderate centrist signal. And to say, hey, I can't be too crazy. Look at me with Liz Cheney. Look at me with, I'm tough on immigration. I'll shoot you if you come to my house. Whatever. That's clearly the route they've taken. I think they had other options though.
Yeah. So let's talk about like the, I guess, successes potentially, or maybe the failures of this strategy. So in terms of the overall momentum, because it's very hard to look at polls, like they're very inconsistent for the most
Yep.
part. You have a lot of junk polling from the right that try to sway the real clear politics average like
Yep.
firmly on the Republican side. And I think that is a deliberate attempt to,
Yeah.
because people want to vote for the party that's winning. Like you want to vote
Mhm.
for the winning team anyway, if you're like in the middle still, or you don't really care about Trump all that much.
Mhm.
Um, I think that there is a lot of that going on, but beyond that, it's like I think Trump has always notoriously been a turnout guy with low propensity and mid propensity voters. So those are like
Yep.
hard to track in general because they're not consistent nor reliable voters. And given all of that, in a post Roe v. Wade overturned world, I think that it's really difficult to just simply look at polls and make an assumption of what's going to happen. So you kind of have to look at the momentum a little bit, and the
Mhm.
momentum certainly favored Kamala Harris early on because I think, uh, sure, once in a blue moon, the donor pressure and the public pressure actually aligned because they
Absolutely.
didn't want to dump millions of dollars to a race that was going to a candidate that was definitely going to lose, right? Nobody wants,
Yep.
people want a return on that investment. So the public responded very positively to having their demands be met and heard. And they rewarded the Kamala Harris campaign with $1 billion, right? They have a
Yep.
massive war chest. So having said all of that, the vibes overall were favoring Kamala Harris. The momentum had swung generally in her direction, and yet they cut into that, in my opinion, especially over the last month or so. They cut into that in a spectacular fashion with this moderate messaging. So overall, I guess my question is like, you talk to people all the time for the run up. You talk to some very unique, very interesting voters, right? And what is your overall vibe on the
Yeah.
ground? Like, are these people responding positively to it? Like, does it seem? Do you talk? I guess the question is, do you talk to the podcast voters at all? Because I want to
I
know
think
what
we
those guys are
do.
thinking.
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, I think about someone we talked to for last week's episode who was a 27-year-old he said he got his news exclusively through Instagram, and he was outside of this Trump event. He had never voted before, and he said that he was going to vote this year. And I was asking him why this year and not previous years. And there was the kind of same, and honestly, it was a very unintentionally rattling off of Trump talking points. He was saying things just feel a little pricier and things feel a little more unsafe. And that was enough for him to kind of feel like he should take a different type of action. I guess to your larger question about momentum, I think about it in a broad way. Like before the switch, and you've kind of said this, Democrats weren't even in the game. Like there was no doubt in my mind that Donald Trump was going to win. Um, After there had been And I think there has been a kind of reorganization of the party. The only thing I would say is the big difference between 2008 and now is I do think Democrats were more concerned about bringing new people into the process, expanding their coalition, kind of reaching a different type of voter, making it feel more like a movement. I think Donald Trump is the movement candidate of this race. And I think Kamala Harris is the Democratic Party. And I think those are important distinction to really understand because Donald Trump's task in this election, I think, is actually a little harder. He has to get all of those Calebs of the world, the 27-year-olds who are pretty inconsistent, to actually come out and
Yeah.
change the scope of the electorate. And
Yeah.
that's not an easy thing, even if they're telling pollsters they're interested in you, even if they're telling their friends they're interested in you. Like those people famously don't always follow through when it comes to it. And we know the Roe v. Wade voter is showing up, right? We
Yeah.
know that the anti-Trump voter, the MSNBC person, the angry Republican over the last couple years from those suburbs, they've already come out in special elections and
Yeah.
midterms already. And so I think it's kind of the way I would answer your question is like you just have to rethink of who the Democratic Party coalition is. If we were still talking about the Obama era, if we were still talking about them needing a movement, I think they would be in big trouble because I don't think that momentum has continued in the same way. I don't think people see her as the type of movement figure folks saw Obama as. But I don't think that's how they actually win. They win through a more affluent, educated political class. It's less of a movement itself. And so there's the strange thing where I think where less people voting, or at least a more traditional type of person voting, is better for Democrats. And so at the same time, the momentum has blunted. I don't think it changes the overall kind of 51-49ness of the race because frankly, the Democrats weren't banking on that type of person in the first place. They like to say they are, right? They like to pretend kind of that that's still their the voter they're most interested in,
Yeah.
but it's not the young person. It's not a mass organization of people of color. It's really a more specific type of person who's actually improved their chances over the last couple elections. And that's the new Democratic Party.
Yeah.
So they have a better shot at winning, but it's less of the type of coalition that I think Democrats like to tell themselves
Yeah,
is their coalition.
it's the Chuck Schumer equation. For every two blue collar
For
vote
sure.
we lose in the across the board, we win two in the suburbs. Like we win one in the
Yep.
suburbs, or we win two in the suburbs. It's like
That's totally what they're thinking. I mean, here in North Carolina, we're about to go out canvassing with people. We're in this suburban area, fast growing. That is their focus, is in converting the kind of diverse suburbs into Democratic voters. And they're actually, if you talk to the Detroits and Philadelphia organizers, they feel like the campaign isn't as focused on them as previous Democratic campaigns are. But that's partly a tell on the way that the lens of the party has kind of shifted.
yeah, I really do think that this is a dangerous gambit. Like I think it's a very dangerous gamble. I think that um like we'll see. I know that the educated, college educated whites in the suburbs are like a resilient voting bloc that consistently
Yeah.
votes, but I don't know if enough of them are going to make up for just simply like the larger number of people that are out there, especially if there is some kind of like hemorrhaging from the base that we have seen, right? Especially
Yeah.
with like the coalitions that existed within the Democratic Party. I think that they're definitely taking that for granted, and we'll see. We'll see how it works out. I want to switch
I
gears
mean,
for a second.
you don't have to look further than 2016, right? A drop off in Milwaukee or Philadelphia, a drop off in Dearborn or Michigan with Arab and Muslim voters. Like it could, there's a lot of ways that this could go wrong, and they basically have hemmed themselves in to a kind of 270 to 268 type of strategy. They
Yeah,
are very tied to that Midwestern blue wall. They are very, and so that has to hold. And those type of things, I think, coming out of the candidate switch, I think we thought of Harris as having a broad new landscape with the Georgias and Arizonas and all these places on the table. But that requires a real multiracial, multi-class movement. And if you limit yourself to really that kind of more traditional voter, that's not you're not going to win the Arizonas and Georgias, but you might win the Wisconsins and Pennsylvanias.
Yeah. So, um, I wanted to ask you something. I want to hear your perspective on this. There has been some stuff in the last month or so that, like, in terms of messaging, that I feel like is harkening back to a very dark era of the 2016 campaign. I'm specifically referring to Barack Obama talking about
Yeah.
black men and how, you know, oh, I guess you guys just don't want to vote for Kamala Harris because she's a woman. And I feel like this scoldy tone, I mean, this is like perhaps a private conversation that people might have behind closed doors, but like when you're Barack Obama and you're openly stating that
Yeah.
as a message, like, you know, that is going to get a lot of play in the media. And I think that there's two things there that I am, I guess, a little bit frustrated with. One, the potential 20% swing for non-college educated male voters, especially
Yeah.
under the age of 50, has been consistent for every demographic group.
For sure.
And black men comprise the smallest percentage of that. So hyper focusing
Yeah.
on black men in that regard, I think, opens up the door for a lot of conversations that you will hear sometimes even from like white women on CNN, who will then turn around and be like, yeah, why aren't they voting for women? And it's like,
It's
it's a very
killing me right
weird,
now.
it's a very weird conversation to have, especially when like black people across the board are still overwhelmingly, including black men, are still overwhelmingly
Yes.
voting for the Democratic Party. And I don't think that I don't think that Democrats understand this as a warning sign of
Yeah.
like the base kind of like falling apart a little bit.
Yeah.
And
I
beyond that, I think like the scold attitude is I feel like they did this with Hillary Clinton when they saw some issues, like,
Yeah.
and I think this is like the last ditch effort to like try to scold people, and it's a demonstrable failure time and time again.
I mean, I gotta say, I hated it. I mean, when I saw what he said and kind of saw the tone in which they were coming at this, it felt really reminiscent of some of the worst versions of Democratic messaging. And I think Barack Obama's been pretty like egregious in some of the tone he's come at black voters with, even while he was president. I
Oh
remember
yeah,
2016, he talking about, if you don't vote for Clinton, you'll be letting me down personally. I mean, and I think the thing that I often come to is say is like, there's no way he would come to different type of voting groups and place the blame on them for their own actions. He would hear those interests. He would listen to those frustrations. I was talking to Governor Wes Moore, only black governor in the country, about the question of black men specifically a couple months ago. And he was saying that Democrats have not done the job of acknowledging folks' frustrations with the political system broadly and the role the party has played in it. We know what the research says about what motivates these group of people. And we know that it is part of a larger educational sorting that's not specific to black men. But Barack Obama is missing all of that type of context when he says that. I
yeah,
also think also think it completely ignores that for the type of black man we're talking about who's dropped off from Democrats, Obama is an avatar of the party's failures on that issue. Like, they are not ready for a lecture from him. They think that he was part of the problem. And so his inability to kind of see himself in his own kind of time in office as the reason people have shifted on ideas of representation, shifted on the ways that Democrats relate to black communities, is itself kind of a self-fulfilling thing. But to your point about the ways that kind of there's been a larger shift among non-college men, I think Democrats could be honest with themselves. They talk more in the cultural language of Twitter and academia. They talk more about their biggest pitch often in the black communities is about representation or getting elite black folks into elite spaces.
yeah.
All of those are things that are way more motivating for a college educated, affluent class of people of color than they are for working class people of color. And so it's no surprise to me that that is reflected in some of the drop off here. And I just think they have to ask themselves, like, do they want to reorient issues to actually speak to these folks? Or is their only message to them one of shame and blame? And I think, like, in this election so far, we've really seen them hit the shame and blame button more than anything else. And I do think that's a big warning sign because if they're repivoting to really focus on this type of coalition, a more college educated one, a more affluent one, I think they're only a Nikki Haley nomination away from getting wiped off the map, you
Yes.
know? So like they are being helped right now because the person on the other side is Donald Trump.
And he's so
And it
bad.
has
It's not
and it
just
has
Donald
not
Trump, but a bad version of him too.
a bad version of Donald Trump, yes. And so I'm saying they have not had the inner party discussions and growing pains to really acknowledge what I think has been a big shift from them in terms of the types of issues they talk about and the folks leading that sort of messaging. And so if there's a gut check for Democrats, even if they win this election, I think it's how do we talk to folks who did not go to college? How do we talk to folks who are and there was such an assumption, again, this is the same point, they did not think they would have to do this because they assumed that people of color would move in their direction to a kind of demographic destiny sense. That undergirds so much of the overconfidence that Democrats have had over the last 6 to 8 years. Is because they have felt that inevitably Latino voters would reject Donald Trump, or inevitably Black people would reject Donald Trump. And I think the thing that I hope, or maybe hope isn't the right word, but the thing that I think they have to have understood by now is that that type of assumption is not true. And
Yeah.
there is no guarantee that the more diverse version of America is a more inevitably liberal democracy.
Yeah.
There's no guarantee of that. And so I think they have to wrestle with that. And it's the big difference between saying the words that Black people aren't a monolith or that Latinos aren't a monolith or whatever, and actually believing and moving like that. Because they know to say it now, but in the end, when you hear Barack's tone, when you hear Obama's tone, he's basically saying that Black men have to do this one thing because they're this one way.
Yeah.
And that's not a winning message.
It
So
it also
I think they
ironically,
have to get to that eventually. I just don't think they have the capacity, frankly, or the voices in the room to do that right now.
like, scolding of that sort, even if it's correct to a certain degree, should never be deployed as a
It's bad
front-facing message.
politics.
That's not, you
It's
can't do that.
yeah.
And I don't know how the Democratic Party has like never really reckoned with that. And I think it's I don't know if it's like the DC media bubble that they're completely captured by, but like that kind of messaging is not going to shake people into going, oh yeah, I just came to my senses. Like this guy is racist, right?
Yeah.
And
I
and
think they and
oh, go
can I
ahead.
say also, like, it's a consistent problem for them, even in this own election cycle. Part of the reason there was a big underrating of Biden's age as a political problem, or a lack of understanding that most people in the country were seeking change rather than the status quo, is because there has been a consistent distance from leaders of the party from the type of like working class, non college folks who are driving a lot of these changes. There was an assumption, I think, from party leaders that Donald Trump would be inherently unacceptable because of things like January 6th or things like his legal problems. That was a bad assumption, too. And so I think if we add up all that we've learned since 2020, you have a consistent story about a Democratic Party whose distance from these type of voters is putting them in pretty bad electoral situations, you know? Now they might have a little get out of jail free card because people's distaste for Donald Trump is so high that it could lead them to a slight electoral college victory or even a bigger one, but that's not about them, you know? And I
Yeah.
still think that eventually these distinctions that they have not wrestled with are going to become very important. And I don't have the evidence over the last couple years, or frankly, the confidence knowing some of the folks who run these campaigns to believe that they even know enough of these type of people, you know, or like care enough, frankly, about these type of people to really do the type of recalibration I imagine will be necessary.
Yeah, I hear a lot of you know, I hear a lot of feedback from people that like are in the campaigns, and they're mostly just like celebrating the massive war chest that they have, and they see that as like, you know, brat summering your way into
Yeah.
the November deadline. And it's, I think that's a truly terrifying prospect that I personally saw when I went to the DNC. I was like, what the fuck? Like, these guys are.
I mean, it's very conventional people for very unconventional times. Like, and so the playbooks they are using are ones that are not necessarily even in the same language. And so, yeah, they can update it with a meme or with TikTok or whatever. And I think they have been trying to do some of that stuff. But I don't, I think you gotta, both parties, like the Republicans have already had their big sea change with Trump. You
Yeah.
know, their big rupture came after 2016 when he broke the party. I think Democrats haven't had their moment of reckoning, but the signs are there that the fault lines are real enough that it might come.
I think the difference between the Republican shift from in the post-Trump world, however, is that he leaned into the base further than previous Republicans had. Whereas I feel like the Democratic Party is constantly moderating against their base, like against the broader population, that time and time again, especially when it's like associated not with a Democrat, but like a faceless ballot initiative, like a ballot measure, will vote for the most progressive possible thing, including but not limited to, you know, the expansion of Medicaid, for example.
Yeah.
Like, these are the things that people want. They have the capacity, no matter what their like weird, dare I say, kind of silly, inconsistent political worldview might look like, when they are staring at something that is going to help them materially, they want it. That's an understandable desire that people have. And it is very frustrating if you have this charisma gap, for example. I think with Kamala Harris, like, she's appealing to suburban voters for sure to a certain degree. But I think like for the broader electorate, I don't think she is like uniquely charismatic at all. And I think that like if you have that issue, right? Like even Joe Biden, when his brain was working, was like a relatively solid retail politician. Like he was great at kissing babies and shaking hands. Like that was something that he did quite well. Not to say that he couldn't do that in 2020, regardless, because of both COVID and because his brain wasn't functioning too well. But the way to make up for that charisma gap, in my opinion, is by having solid policies like the price gouging thing, like finding the best possible way to communicate how you are going to fix people's issues directly, and then putting that at the forefront of your campaign rather than like vague generalizations about the opportunity economy and how you're going to give small business owners $50,000 in tax cuts. And I haven't seen that at all from the Democratic Party, and it is certainly frustrating. There are obviously a lot of gimmies here too. Like one of the biggest ones, of course, is the ongoing atrocities in both Gaza and Lebanon. Something that is profoundly popular across the board. Even majority Republicans want a ceasefire, and the only mechanism to enact that ceasefire is fairly simple. It's just one phone call from Biden saying, we're no longer giving you any weapons if you keep this up, which Biden, weirdly enough, presented as an opportunity now in the last iteration, as they are, as Israel has shut off humanitarian aid into North Gaza, as they're pummeling North Gaza. And I found it shocking. I found it, dare I say, spiteful that Biden was pushing the deadline for a potential embargo, if humanitarian aid is still restricted to North Gaza, to after the election.
Yeah.
Like,
unfortunately, I have to go, so this might have to be my last answer. But I want to say something to that point. The biggest thing that Democrats can do is respond in policy. Is to tell a story that actually motivates folks and combines messenger with message. Now, we've talked a lot about the message front, but I also think there's a big piece here about Harris not going through the primary and not getting those type of reps to be able to communicate the differences within the party, how they've changed over the years, and kind of get Democrats on the same front headed into the general election. No matter what happens between now and the next 3 weeks from now, I still think Joe Biden is the secret main most important person of this race because his inability to step aside stop the party from being able to have an open conversation with itself about what it believes. And I think that type of conversation could have been a motivating or jolting thing in an election where apathy is just as big of a deal as the choices in front of them. And so sometimes it feels as if they run from having these conversations in an attempt to be everything to everyone rather than actually answer people's concerns on that front. And we should say Republicans have an easier job on this front. They have a more monochromatic base. They have a base that believes more of the same thing that is more alike than the Democratic one, right?
Yeah.
Diversity is actually a challenge for Democrats because not everyone believes the same thing on a lot of stuff. But one of the things I do think is true is that hiding from it is not going to be the most helpful. And I also think that they have been avoiding, I mean, ever since 2016, they have been a reactive party to Donald Trump rather than an affirmative party laying out a kind of vision. I think the last time Democrats had that sort of conversation was in an Obama era where there was like a vision that was being laid out.
Yeah.
And Biden won, frankly, by saying this primary should not really be about vision. It should be about who can beat Donald Trump.
Yeah.
That has just delayed this inevitable conversation within the party further and further and further. And so even if Kamala Harris wins, I still don't think that solves that front because she's more of a weather vane for where the party exists than she is setting an agenda going forward. And so I just think that eventually these chickens will come home to roost. And whether it's this election that kind of hurts them on that front, or if it's a kind of open party question or where they go on issues like immigration or the like going forward, they're going to have to wrestle with this stuff. And even things like foreign policy cannot be things that they put aside any longer. They have an increasingly diverse electorate, increasingly first generation. Black and Latinos are coming from different parts of the country. They don't look the same as they look 40,
Yeah.
50 years ago. And so they're going to have to actually, I think, spend time on issues that they have not considered and frankly have benefited from not considering. Even if you take foreign policy, my last point, back in 2020, there were so many differences between all those candidates. But basically, bar Bernie Sanders, most of them believed exactly the same thing when it came to Israel.
Yeah.
Most of them believed exactly the same thing when it came to a lot of foreign policy questions. I think that's changed among Democrats. And so where they fall now is going to be a bigger, more open question. And we frankly won't know until after this election because they're going to punt that as far as they can.
Yeah. All right. Astead, thank you so much for coming on. It was
thank
wonderful
you. I
having
always
you.
appreciate it.
You're brilliant as always, and I hope to have you on again. Hiện giờ thay phòng nhà phòng công công này, chỉ做開眼書嘛，不讀嘅。